Before the empires, before the pyramids, before even the taming of bronze, there was Jericho, a quiet city, older than history itself, nestled beside a spring in the shadow of mountains and salt. What did they build here? All those thousands of years ago, before writing, before wheels. Who were these people who gathered? Not to conquer, but simply to live together. Tonight we're going to walk back, far back, to the very beginning. To a time when stone was still sacred, and cities were a brand new idea. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and share this story with someone who might need a peaceful journey tonight. And tell me, just for a bit of company, where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? Let's slow down and step quietly into the past. The land before cities. Long before Jericho had walls, long before it had streets or hearths or even a name, there was only the land. The earth here had always been generous, cradled between two silent mountain ranges, kissed by a sun that warmed but rarely punished, and most precious of all, fed by a spring, an eternal spring, that bubbled gently from the rocks, never ceasing, never failing. The spring is still there, even now. It runs quietly through the heart of the Jericho Valley, and it has run that way for more than 10,000 years. This simple fact, so soft and so easy to miss, is one of the great reasons Jericho exists at all. Water has always been the first invitation. Where it flows, life follows, and so it was here. We go back now, some 11,000 years, to a time when the ice had only just loosened its grip on the world. Woolly mammoths still roamed the edges of the earth. Glaciers, in their slow retreat, carved the bones of Europe and Asia, and the world breathed again after a long cold sleep. In the midst of this awakening, humans, clever and cautious, began to change. No longer did they wander endlessly. In a few rare places they stopped, they gathered, they built, and one of the very first places they did this, as far as we know, was here, at the oasis, that would one day be called Jericho. But back then, there were no names, only the rhythm of days, only the strange new life of staying in one place. What must that have felt like? To live not as a shadow drifting across seasons, but as something rooted, to wake in the same spot where you had slept the night before, and to know, even quietly, that this place was yours. The people who came to this place were not like us, and yet they were. They had no writing, no books, no metal tools, and yet they had language. They had memories, they had songs, they knew how to shape stone, how to bind reeds, how to follow the stars. They carried the wisdom of 1,000 generations in their heads, and in this quiet oasis, they began to build something new. There was no plan, not at first, just shelter. Walls made from earth, roofs woven from brush and bark, but one by one the houses clustered, one beside another, circles forming into groups, groups forming into something more, and slowly, very slowly, a village was born. It is strange to think of a city being born like this, without fanfare, without a name, without any idea what it might one day mean. But that is how history begins, in the smallest of choices, in the daily rhythm of survival, and this village, this tiny dusty seed of Jericho, was the beginning of something no one had ever done before, because they didn't leave, and that changed everything. Stone by stone, the first walls, they stayed. That single, quiet decision, to remain rooted in this place, sparked a change in the human story that would echo through the ages. And as the seasons passed and the years began to gather, the people of ancient Jericho built more than just homes. They built something no one had ever seen before. They built walls. We do not know the names of the ones who dug the first foundation, or who carried the first stones from the fields. We do not know who shaped the mud, or who stood back at the end of a long day, hands sore, backs tired, and said softly, "This will hold." But we do know this: over 10,000 years ago, the people of Jericho constructed a wall that wrapped around their small settlement like an earthen embrace. A wall made not for kings or for armies, a wall built for something more primal: protection, security, a boundary between the chaos of the wild and the calm of the hearth. This wall was massive for its time, over 3 meters high, with a thickness that suggested deep thought and deeper effort. It stood not as a show of wealth or power, but as an answer to a question we will never fully hear. Perhaps it was protection from wild animals, perhaps floods, or perhaps from other people. Strangers, outsiders. Whatever the reason, Jericho's walls were the first of their kind, the very first in human memory, and they were only the beginning. Not long after the walls rose from the mud and stone, something even more astonishing appeared at the heart of the settlement: a tower. It's still there, in part, weathered, crumbling, half buried in time, but unmistakable. Round, built from heavy stone, once rising up nearly 10 meters into the sky, and containing a spiral staircase curling through its belly, built, it seems, with deliberate care, with vision, and this vision, the idea of something tall, something central, was completely new. Try to imagine it. You're standing in a world where almost everything is flat, the trees are your skyline, the hills roll gently in the distance, and then suddenly, there's this thing, this tower, rising from the earth, like a monument to a dream you didn't know you had. No one knows exactly what it was for. A lookout, perhaps, a place of gathering, of ritual, or just the simple, bold idea of creating something that reached higher than anything before it. We may never know. But whatever its purpose, the Tower of Jericho tells us something astonishing. These people were not just surviving, they were imagining. They were shaping the world to suit something within them. A sense of place, a sense of community, maybe even a sense of the divine. And with that imagination came something even more powerful than stone, permanence. Because to build a tower is to believe in the future. It is to say, we will still be here tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. They were not like us. And yet they were. They had no metal, no writing, no glass, no books, but they had families, stories, tools made of flint, fire pits dug into the soft earth, smoke curling into the early morning air. They shaped their homes from mud and straw, packing walls by hand, smoothing surfaces with polished stones. Their houses were round at first, with low roofs and sunken floors, cozy and quiet. Over time these became rectangular, a shift that hinted at new ideas, new needs, new rhythms of life. And beneath the floors of their homes, they buried their dead. This too tells us something, because to bury your ancestors under the place you sleep is to believe in continuity. It is to live not just in a house, but in a lineage. It is to anchor yourself to memory, to say, we belong here, we always have, we always will. In some cases, the skulls of the dead were removed, cleaned, and carefully decorated with plaster and paint. Shells were pressed into the eye sockets, hairlines were sculpted, faces, silent and serene, were brought back to life and placed in special corners of the home. Why? Was it reverence? A desire to keep the ancestors close? Or perhaps an early form of spirituality, an understanding that even when breath is gone, presence remains? We cannot ask them, but their hands speak through the dust, and the message is clear. These were not simple people. They were thoughtful, symbolic, and quietly revolutionary. In this city of stone and spring, they made something new of the human experience. They farmed, though they had only just begun to understand how. They herded goats, grew barley, and watched the skies. They worked together, ate together, grieved together, and across generations so many that we cannot count. They stayed. Thousands of years would pass. New people would arrive. New tools, new ideas. The round houses would be leveled. The walls rebuilt and expanded. The tower, buried and forgotten beneath the weight of time. But the city never truly vanished. Even when it was destroyed by flood, or by flame, by the slow unraveling of society, or the sudden violence of invasion, people returned. The spring never dried, and where water flows, people follow. By the time of the great cities of Sumer and Akkad, Jericho was already ancient. When Babylon rose, Jericho was a memory. When Rome marched eastward, Jericho had already been conquered and rebuilt more times than anyone could count. It was mentioned in ancient texts. Whispers of its walls echoed in scripture. The city became legend, its name passed down in story, in faith, in song. And still, beneath layers of sand and stone, the oldest parts waited. In 1951, archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon arrived at the site. She was not the first to dig here, but she was the most meticulous. And as she peeled away the layers, carefully, slowly, with patient hands, she uncovered the truth. The tower, the walls, the bones of houses buried beneath modern Jericho, and the realization dawned. This was no ordinary ruin. This was a beginning. A city more than 10,000 years old. A city built before writing, before bronze, before the wheel, before the pharaohs, before anything we might call civilization. Even now people live in Jericho. Modern homes rise where ancient ones once stood. Children play in the shade of trees that drink from the same water their ancestors did. The spring still flows, clear and cool, a silver thread tying present to past. And though much has changed, something remains. It's in the quiet curve of the hills, in the wind that whispers through the palms, in the stones half buried in the earth, too smooth, too round, to be natural. in the way the sun sets behind the western ridge, casting golden light over a city that remembers. Jericho is old, older than kings, older than myth, older than even the word city itself. But age alone does not give it meaning. What gives it meaning is what it tells us, that even in the earliest days, humans dreamed. They gathered, they built, they imagined something greater than themselves, and made it real with nothing more than earth and effort and time. And that perhaps is what makes Jericho more than a city. It makes it a beginning, a quiet, steady breath at the dawn of civilization. As time moved forward, Jericho did not stay the same. How could it? A city that lives for thousands of years must inevitably become many different places across its own long life. And so Jericho changed again and again, reborn in the hands of new people under new skies, with new voices calling it by different names. But even as it changed, it remained tethered to its land. The spring still murmured softly beneath the hills, unchanged, flowing with the same easy confidence. It whispered through each new era, through the dust of stone-cutting Neolithic builders, through the bronze-clad warriors of the age to come, and through the words of strangers who arrived with new beliefs, new tools, and new intentions. By the time the Bronze Age took hold, some 5,000 years ago, the Jericho we first met was already ancient. It had been forgotten and rediscovered, dismantled and rebuilt, more than once. New people came with carts and herds, with fire-hardened pots and new customs. They did not know the hands that built the first tower, but they walked the same land. They found the ruins and built among them, around them, even on top of them, as though each new life in Jericho was one more story written atop the last. And the walls returned. These later walls were larger, grander, more than just protective. They were part of what defined the city. Stone and mud brick, thick and high, rising with a strength that seemed to declare, "We are still here." These walls likely formed a kind of crescent, curving along the western slope of the mound, and beyond them, the city itself grew denser, more complex. The houses were now rectangular, aligned in neat rows with courtyards and storage pits. Families lived close to one another, their daily lives echoing through narrow streets, their footsteps packed into the very soil archaeologists would one day uncover. And around this cluster of homes and walls, something else took shape: trade. Jericho was no longer a quiet village of the early Neolithic. It was becoming a node, a point of connection in the great human web. Obsidian, flint, seashells, copper, materials that had no origin near Jericho, began to appear in its soil. That meant others were coming here. Caravans, traders, wanderers, people with news and goods from far beyond the desert rim. Imagine it, the early morning sun rising over the hills, casting gold across the stones. In the streets, merchants calling softly to one another, animals stirring, bread baking on hot stones, a child running to fetch water from the spring, a woman weaving, a man repairing a wall, all of them living ordinary lives, in a place that had already seen 5,000 years of memory. As the Bronze Age waned and centuries drifted by, Jericho passed again through the shadows of history. It was abandoned more than once, its walls crumbling quietly into the dust. But the spring never dried, and the ruins, layer upon layer of homes, stones, bones and ash, remained, waiting. Then, in a time of iron and empire, the city's name appeared again, in stories, in scripture, in myth. The book of Joshua tells of Jericho's fall, a city whose walls came crashing down at the blast of horns and the shouts of men. A miracle, a warning, a moment wrapped in mystery. Whether that story rests in memory or in metaphor, its power is undeniable, for it brought Jericho not just into history, but into legend. From this point on, Jericho became more than a place. It became a symbol. To fall like the walls of Jericho was to fall completely, suddenly, fatefully. The name became a touchstone, a way for later generations to imagine the old world, the ancient world, the world that once was and could never fully be known. But the real city, the one of stone and spring, did not vanish. It persisted. Through Assyrian conquest, Babylonian rule, Persian governance, and the rising tide of the Greeks, Jericho, scarred and scarred again, continued to exist, sometimes in ruin, sometimes rebuilt, sometimes quiet, sometimes briefly powerful. Each time a civilization fell, Jericho remained. Its soil, rich with memory, kept the city alive. By the time the Romans arrived in the eastern reaches of their empire, Jericho was once again a living town, smaller now but still vital. They called it Jericho, and in their hands, it became a villa town, shaded with date palms, fig trees and fragrant balsam, said to grow nowhere else in the world. It was here that Herod the Great built a winter palace, complete with aqueducts, swimming pools and gardens. He chose this place not for its military strength or its political centrality, but for something simpler: its beauty, its quiet, its water. The spring that had drawn the first settlers still ran, still whispered through reeds and stones, still made this land special. And so Roman Jericho became a retreat, a place of rest in the cool shadows of the desert edge. Travelers passed through, priests and merchants lingered, palm fronds rustled in the wind, and above it all, the memory of the old city hung like a distant echo. But the city never belonged to one people for long. Empires rose, then crumbled like the walls that had once been legend. The Byzantines came, the early Muslims, the Crusaders, the Ottomans. Each layered their own world upon the earth of Jericho, building, breaking, rebuilding, again and again. And beneath their feet, always were the bones of the first homes, the base of the tower, the ring of the wall. Even if they did not know it, they were walking atop the beginning of cities. For long centuries, the world forgot where Jericho truly was. The spring still flowed, of course quiet and steady, but the ancient walls were gone, buried under the slow weight of time. Sand drifted over the ruins. Dust softened the outlines of crumbled homes. The tower, the oldest known built by human hands, lay hidden beneath layers of cities that had risen and fallen across 10,000 years. To any traveler passing by, the hill that marked the spot looked like just another rise in the land, a natural mound, a resting place for the wind. But the earth remembers. It holds memory not in words, but in layers, each year a little deeper, each stone a little quieter. And though it may take centuries, the stories it holds eventually return to the surface. In the 19th century, long after Jericho's name had been turned into fable and the walls reduced to metaphor, explorers and scholars once more turned their eyes to the ancient Near East. Maps were drawn, old names were traced across new boundaries, and in time, a gentle, unassuming hill on the western edge of a dusty oasis caught someone's attention. They called it Tel es-Sultan, the Hill of the Sultan. It was here, beneath that small and silent rise, that the true story of Jericho began to stir. In the winter of 1951, a plane touched down in the Middle East. Aboard it was a woman named Kathleen Kenyon, a quiet, meticulous archaeologist with a deep respect for the past and a firm belief in careful work. She had been trained under Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who taught her how to excavate with surgical precision, layer by layer, allowing the past to emerge as it had been laid down. Kenyon was different from the early treasure hunters of archaeology. She was not searching for gold or kings. She was looking for something more elusive: truth. Jericho at the time was still tangled in myth. Some believed the ruins to be the remains of the biblical city destroyed by Joshua. Others claimed it was older than any known city, perhaps the oldest in the world, but no one really knew. Kenyon wanted to find out. At first the mound yielded little, just the dry crunch of gravel and windblown soil. But soon as the team worked downward, the past began to reveal itself. Stone by stone, layer by layer, they peeled back the skin of centuries, and what they found was more than anyone had expected. The hill at Tel es-Sultan was not a hill at all. It was a mountain of memory, a city built atop a city, atop a city, atop a city, going back farther than anyone imagined. As Kenyon's team worked, they began to realize that they were not digging into one Jericho, but into dozens. Each layer told a different story. Each stone bore the weight of a forgotten life, and at the very bottom, beneath all the Roman roads and Bronze Age foundations, they found something astonishing: a wall. But not the wall of Joshua, not the wall of conquest or collapse. This wall was different, thicker, rounder, older. It had been built with care by hands that had never seen writing or pottery or bronze. A wall of stone and mud brick, built at a time when woolly mammoths still roamed in the far north. And beside that wall, a tower, rising from the soil like a buried spine. The structure stood nearly 10 meters tall, its steps winding up inside like the coils of a sleeping serpent. It had been built more than 10,000 years ago, a time when most people on Earth still wandered with the seasons, gathering what they could, unsure of tomorrow. And yet here, in this oasis by the Dead Sea, a group of people had stayed. They had settled, they had built, they had made the first city. Why? That is the question that echoes most quietly and most powerfully through the layers of Jericho. Why here? Why then? Why did they build a tower when there were no enemies to fight, no armies to watch for, no writing to record what they feared or loved? Was it for ceremony? Was it a symbol? A place for gathering? A shrine to something lost? No one knows for certain. What we do know is this: they came together, they shared food, they buried their dead beneath the floors of their homes. They worked side by side to raise walls and dig out living spaces, to shape the first patterns of life in one place. They chose not to wander, but to stay, and in doing so they changed the world, not suddenly, not all at once, but step by patient step, season by season, grain by grain. That is what Jericho teaches, in its deepest bones, that even the great unfolding of human history can begin with the quiet decision to settle near a spring, to build shelter, to watch the stars from the same spot each night, and to believe that this spot, this land, this hill, might still matter tomorrow. In the soft silence of an early Neolithic home, the past was never far away. Beneath the packed clay floors of Jericho's ancient dwellings, the dead lay sleeping, not in distant cemeteries or hidden tombs, but directly below the feet of the living. Fathers, mothers, children, entire generations laid to rest within the homes they once inhabited. This practice, strange to our modern senses, was part of daily life here. When someone died, their body was carefully prepared and then buried beneath the floor of the house. Sometimes their bones were placed in simple positions, curled as if in sleep. Sometimes they were left for time to clean, and then exhumed, their skulls removed and kept near the living. It may sound unsettling, but this was not an act of fear or forgetting. It was remembrance. The people of Jericho lived with their ancestors. They shared space with memory. The boundaries between the past and present were thin and porous. Perhaps in some quiet way, they believed their loved ones still watched over the household, guiding them through the cycles of the seasons. In some homes, archaeologists found skulls that had been lovingly altered, the hollow eye sockets filled with shells, the faces carefully rebuilt with plaster, a kind of early portraiture, eerily lifelike masks that captured a memory in 3 dimensions. These were not merely relics, they were people, remembered, honored, kept close. In this way, Jericho was not only the first city, it may also have been one of the first places where people consciously tried to preserve the idea of identity after death. A city where memory was not written down, but shaped in clay, tucked beneath beds, and carried in the hearts of the living. Life in early Jericho unfolded slowly, predictably, in rhythm with the seasons. Mornings might begin with the soft tapping of stones, grinding grain into flour. Women worked with heavy mortars, slowly turning wild barley and emmer wheat into a coarse, nourishing meal. Children fetched water from the spring, their feet stirring dust into soft spirals. Men returned from the hunt with gazelle, hare, or wild boar slung across their backs. There were no written records, no great monuments yet. But the city thrived in its simplicity. Homes were round, made of mud brick, their walls low and thick to keep the heat out. They clustered together like cells, separated by narrow paths and open courtyards. People likely gathered outside in the cooler evenings, sharing food, stories, songs. Fires crackled in small hearths. Ash drifted upward into the starlit sky. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal might howl across the empty plain. Within those early walls, life pulsed gently, births, deaths, the slow shaping of the seasons. There was no hurry, no conquest, just the patient work of living in one place, long enough to call it home. In the earliest layers of Jericho, there were no crops, no wheat fields or goat pens, but over time, something shifted. The people who had once foraged and hunted began to experiment. Not with sudden certainty, but with cautious curiosity. Seeds were planted near homes, grains were gathered, not only to eat, but to replant. Wild animals, sheep, goats, maybe even pigs, were brought close, not just for meat, but for milk, wool, companionship. It did not happen in one generation, nor did it happen the same way for everyone. But slowly, patiently, the city began to shape the landscape around it. Fields replaced forest, animals were corralled. People no longer moved with the herds, they made the herds come to them. And with this came change. The houses became larger, storage pits were dug, clay bins were used to store grain. With food came security, and with security came population. And with population came pressure, more mouths to feed, more space needed. More boundaries to defend. What had begun as a peaceful oasis was becoming something more complex, more fragile, more deeply human. And so the walls rose, around the 7th millennium BCE, long before the Tower of Babel, before the pyramids, before writing or metal, the people of Jericho built a wall. Not a simple fence, but a tall, thick barrier of stone and clay. It encircled their homes. It defined what was inside, and what was out. And standing beside it, perhaps even predating it, was the tower. That ancient tower, nearly 10 meters tall, has long puzzled archaeologists. Why did they build it? There were no nearby enemies to repel, no siege weapons to resist, no written records to explain. Was it a watchtower, a storehouse, a symbol of power, or something more mysterious, a monument to the sky, the sun, the ancestors below? Some have suggested it was built to mark the summer solstice, casting its long shadow across the village like a slow-moving sundial. Others believe it was a gathering place, a place of ceremony, of song, of silence. Whatever its purpose, the tower still stands, its base embedded deep in the soil of time, a monument not to kings, but to community, to the quiet, shared strength of people living together in one place for the first time in history. And as the centuries passed, the wall and tower faded into the earth, but the city lived on. The winds over Jericho are dry now, but there was a time when they carried the scent of water and damp earth. In those early days, the spring that fed Jericho gushed strong, seeping up from hidden places in the rock. It filled channels, cut rivulets through the soil, and watered fields of barley and emmer. Life here pulsed with this water. It was sacred, not in words or doctrines, but in practice. To lose the spring would be to lose the city, and so every planting season was a ritual. Not one of temples or priests, at least, not yet, but of hands in the soil, of watchful eyes on the horizon, of quiet hope that the rains would come again, and not too hard. Because while the water gave life, it also reminded them who was in control. Sometimes the rains would come too heavy, the flood would slip down from the hills and pour into the plain, stirring the dust into rivers and turning paths into torrents. Mud brick houses, homes built with patience and care, could dissolve into the earth overnight, and then the work would begin again. The people of Jericho were not strangers to loss. Over the long millennia they rebuilt and rebuilt again. Each layer of the tell, the hill that formed from centuries of living, was a record not just of triumph, but of quiet endurance. No two houses were ever rebuilt in quite the same way, but they always returned to this place, because the spring still flowed, because the ground still remembered them. In the quiet gaps between disasters, life returned to a rhythm. Women would wake before the sun, and tend to the grinding stones. The sound of pestle against mortar, a soft thudding, would echo through the little courtyards. Children would scatter grain for birds, then race after each other in the dust, their laughter like the birdsong of the city. Men prepared tools, flint blades and obsidian knives, chipped carefully from raw stone traded from faraway hills. There were no beasts of burden yet, no carts, just strong arms and long patience, and every evening the people returned home. They sat close around the fire, not for warmth alone, but for each other. Stories passed between generations, stories of the old flood, of the year the grain spoiled, of the fox that stole eggs, of the time a tower touched the sky. We do not know their names, we do not know their songs, but we know they sang. Because where people gather, music follows, and where firelight flickers, so too does memory. Jericho's memory lives in the soil. As the centuries turned and the city grew, something began to shift in the minds of its people. Once the world had been only the present, the hunt, the harvest, the next morning, but now there was a past, and there was a future. People were beginning to understand time in layers, like the tell beneath their feet. They remembered their dead, they honored their ancestors, and slowly, perhaps inevitably, they began to ask questions not about the spring or the seeds, but about the sky, the stars, the silence. The sacred took shape, not in temples, not yet, but in ritual, in shared meals, in burials and offerings. Small tokens placed in the soil, a shell from a distant shore, a tool too fine for work, a bowl decorated with careful patterns. They had no gods, as we understand them now, but they had awe, they had reverence, and that too is sacred. Somewhere in those early centuries, people first looked at the spring and saw not just water, but a gift. Somewhere someone first looked at the mountain and saw not just rock, but a presence. And thus, a city became something more than a shelter. It became a home for meaning. All cities rise, but all cities strain. Jericho's greatest strength was also its greatest fragility. It was still, in many ways, an experiment. Grain stores grew full, people lived longer, the population swelled, and then, inevitably, the balance slipped. Perhaps there was a drought, perhaps a disease came, perhaps the spring faltered for a season, or the crops failed, or enemies came down from the hills. We do not know the moment, but we see its shadow in the soil, a burned layer, a broken wall, a sudden change in pottery. The city did not vanish, but it broke. What had been stable began to fray. People moved, homes were abandoned, The neat circles of settlement gave way to scattered lines, the rhythm faltered, and yet still the spring flowed, so some remained, others returned. The tell, already forming from centuries of debris and rebuilding, grew higher, another layer, another memory. As time passed, a new pattern emerged, one not easily seen at first, not by the eyes of those living there, and not even by the archaeologists who would arrive thousands of years later. But then someone noticed the skull. It was buried carefully just beneath the floor of a long-abandoned house. And not just any skull. It had been preserved with strange care. The face coated in plaster, the eye sockets filled with shells, a human head, transformed into a kind of portrait, a memory given form, and it was not alone. More followed beneath thresholds, tucked near hearths, always beneath the living places, not in graveyards, not far away. These ancestors lived with their descendants, or rather, the memory of them did. This was something new. These were not simply burials, they were acts of love, of belonging, of continuity. A family might live for generations in one place. When a parent or grandparent died, they buried them not outside the home, but within it, underneath, as though saying, "You are not gone, you are still with us." There is something deeply human in this gesture, a wish that the dead might remain close, that the walls and the floor might hold them gently, that their presence would linger. In Jericho it did. At some point, how early we do not know, Jericho's people built a wall. It was not the kind of wall we think of now. It wasn't built to keep armies out. There were no armies, not yet. There were no kings, no siege engines, just people, and fear. Perhaps the fear was of water, perhaps of animals, perhaps of something less tangible, the unknown. But the wall was real, thick, tall, built from stone, and at its base, a circular tower over 20 feet high, with a staircase curling up its center like a seashell. This was not a defensive structure alone, it was a symbol. To build a wall like that took enormous effort. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of days. It required planning, cooperation, shared purpose. It was in every sense a public work. But more than that, it was an idea made stone, that the people of Jericho had become something more than wandering clans, that they could shape their world, that they could hold back the wilderness, even if only a little. The tower still stands, its steps worn smooth by hands long gone. It is one of the oldest known monuments built by human hands, and though its builders' names have been lost, their vision remains quietly rising from the dust. Even after the first collapse, Jericho did not disappear. It shrank, it changed. But it remembered. New houses were built simpler, perhaps, than before. The neat planning gave way to a more organic sprawl. Walls buckled, streets vanished, but the people stayed. Some moved away, others came in. Generations passed, and beneath the surface the tell grew deeper still. If you stood there today, looking down over the ruins, you might not think much had changed, but time had passed. Centuries, even millennia, and still, they buried their dead beneath their homes. Still, they planted in the soil nourished by the spring. Still, they shaped stone and clay and wood, and lived by the rhythm of sunrise and grain harvest. Jericho was not a kingdom, not an empire. It left no golden statues or grand libraries, but it did something more enduring. It kept going. When others faltered, when cities crumbled, Jericho endured. And this quiet resilience may be its greatest achievement. But the world beyond Jericho was changing. Across the Fertile Crescent, other villages had grown into towns. In the north, in places like Tsantol-Huik, people began painting their walls with scenes of bulls and birds and people. They buried their dead with jewelry. They crafted obsidian blades and fine baskets. Trade routes formed not roads, not yet, but invisible threads between settlements. Obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Red Sea, bitumen from the valleys. Ideas, too, traveled. Jericho was not alone anymore. And yet in many ways it was older than them all. Its roots went deeper, its walls more weathered, its traditions ancient even to its neighbors. Some archaeologists speak of a cultural horizon, an invisible wave of change that swept through the ancient world, and Jericho stood right at the edge of it. Did its people feel that? Did they notice the new kinds of tools, the new types of houses, the changing ways of burying the dead? Did they resist? Or adapt? We do not know, but we do know this: they kept building. They kept planting. They kept burying their memories beneath the floor. They watched the sun rise and set behind the same hills their ancestors had once climbed, and still, the spring flowed. There is a kind of silence in old places, one that is not truly quiet, but full of waiting. In Jericho, even after so many centuries, that silence lingered. It pooled in the shadows of crumbled walls and settled into the curves of sun-baked homes. It whispered through olive groves that had grown where houses once stood, and in the thick stratigraphy of the tell itself, that artificial hill layered with human lives. It spoke with the slow patience of stone. Kenyon's team, long after their first arrival, kept peeling back those layers, mud brick by mud brick, inch by careful inch. Each layer told a story. Some were charred, others washed with silt, still others quietly abandoned, a pot left on a hearth, as if its owner might return. What they found was not a single city, but dozens, each one rising from the remains of the last. Not in defiance, but as a continuation, a slow accretion of lives, pressed together by time. And here is the strange thing, each rebuilding did not always bring new glory. There was no straight line upward. Sometimes, houses became smaller, streets grew narrower, artifacts, less refined. In these moments, it's easy to imagine fatigue setting in, but still they stayed. Why? Perhaps because of the spring, or the ancestors buried underfoot, or maybe simply because they had no reason to leave. The world beyond the hills may have grown busy and restless, but Jericho remained rooted. Even if the world forgot it, it remembered itself. The deeper the archaeologists dug, the simpler the tools became. Stone replaced metal. Basket impressions showed where pottery had not yet been invented. And still humanity's will to shape the world was there, resilient, creative, quiet. Fires burned low in stone-lined hearths, warming families as they ground grain into flour, baked flatbread on smooth stones, and stirred seeds and pulses in ceramic bowls. Pottery, when it came, marked a kind of revolution, not of violence but of storage, of memory. A pot can hold more than grain. It holds time, a fingerprint in wet clay, a decorative notch made by a fingernail, a crack sealed with bitumen, each one a signature of someone we will never know, but whose hand shaped the world we now live in. The clay of Jericho remembered them, even when names were lost. Domestication did not arrive all at once. It crept in gradually, like dawn spilling across the desert. At first, perhaps the animals came on their own, drawn by scraps, warmth and safety. Dogs may have padded through the alleys of Jericho long before sheep or goats ever bleated from pens. In time, humans learned more. Which plants grew better with each season, which seeds could be saved, which animals bred more docile, which ones gave milk or wool or meat without much fuss. This was not yet agriculture as we know it, but it was close. It was the long rehearsal before the full performance, and it changed everything. It freed time, time to build, time to raise children, time to remember, time to bury the dead with ceremony, time to wonder. A slow revolution, written not in blood, but in barley. One of the most haunting discoveries beneath the soil of Jericho were the plastered skulls, delicate, carefully made, eyeless but somehow watching. These were not buried and forgotten. They were shaped, faces lovingly recreated with lime plaster, seashells pressed into empty sockets, perhaps once painted. These were ancestors, perhaps elders, perhaps leaders, or parents. They may have been kept in homes, arranged on shelves or platforms, a form of remembrance older than writing. Their exact meaning is lost. We can only guess, but perhaps the skulls watched over the living. Perhaps they were reminders of continuity. Perhaps they were loved. They were not thrown away. They were kept. They were part of the home. And in that we glimpse something familiar. We too keep photographs. We light candles. We whisper names. They did it with lime and shell and silence. When all else failed. When earthquakes cracked walls. When fire swept through rooftops. When neighbors vanished and generations forgot, one thing remained. The spring. Ines Sultan, as it is still called today, has never stopped flowing. It flowed for the hunter-gatherers who first knelt beside it to drink, for the farmers who dug irrigation channels, for the builders who carried water to mix with lime, for children who played in its shallows, for mourners who washed before burial. It flowed when Jericho rose, when it fell, when it rose again. Even today, that spring gives life to the land. Palm trees grow tall, oranges and figs ripen in the sun, and just beyond, the tell still rises, an unassuming hill to the eye, but to time itself, a mountain. That water connects them all, the living and the dead, the remembered and the forgotten. So what was Jericho? It was not a palace, it was not a capital, it was older than kings, older than writing, older than the myths that would later try to claim it. It was a place of slow, quiet perseverance, a place where people, without metal, without armies, without books, changed the world by staying in one place long enough to listen to it. They listened to the earth and learned to coax food from it. They listened to the seasons and learned when to plant and when to wait. They listened to their dead and learned to build memory into the very walls of their homes. And though we may never know their names or the sound of their voices, we walk in the shape they left behind. Cities began here, not with conquest, but with care. And as sleep begins to wrap gently around you, like a blanket stitched from forgotten years, remember this: long ago, before pyramids or empires or prophets or poems, there was Jericho, the first city on earth, still waiting, still watching, still listening. As the sun rose each day over the Jordan Valley, its golden light poured gently over the low hills and shimmered on the quiet surface of the spring. In that gentle warmth, the people of ancient Jericho carried on with their quiet lives, tending to their early gardens, inspecting the slow progress of their barley, or kneeling to shape clay into something useful, something lasting. Though the world around them remained largely wild and unknown, these people had carved a new rhythm into the land. They lived not only in the shelter of hills or caves, as so many before them had done, but together, grouped in clusters of homes, with the earth beneath their feet, reshaped into compacted mud and stone. Each home was a circle. Thick, rounded walls of mud brick rose to meet a roof made from bundled reeds and packed earth. The floors were neatly plastered, and though plain to modern eyes, they were signs of an emerging intimacy with space, of dwellings designed not only to keep out the rain, but to hold in warmth, to shield families from cold winds, and to welcome the gathering shadows at dusk. Even in these early days, the city was not just a place to live, but a place to return to. And this is perhaps one of the great mysteries of Jericho. Why this place? Why here? The answer, as it often is with ancient human settlements, comes down to water. The spring that flows from the ground beneath the city, Ionis Sultan, as it is known today, has never stopped. It ran before the first homes were built, and it still runs now, thousands of years later. While other rivers shifted course or dried up, Jericho's spring remained. To the ancient people, it must have seemed like a miracle, a source of life that never failed, even as summers baked the earth and winters swept in with bitter cold. In an otherwise arid landscape, the spring would have given rise to trees, grasses, and abundant animal life, drawing in not just humans, but entire ecosystems. And so, generation after generation, they stayed. By around 9500 BCE, the community that would one day be known as Jericho had already begun to shape itself. It was not yet a city, as we would think of it. No broad avenues, no writing carved in stone, but it was something new, something the world had never seen before. A place where people stopped moving, a place where families stayed, and perhaps even more remarkably, it was a place of shared effort. Over time, the people of Jericho began to build structures that were larger and more complex than anything a single family could have accomplished alone. Together, they hauled stones and stacked bricks, shaping something immense and strangely symbolic, a round tower, nearly 10 meters tall, rising silently from the soft earth. What was it for? Some say it was a grain silo, a place to protect food from animals and thieves. Others suggest it was a defensive lookout, built to warn of danger. Still others believe it held a ritual purpose, perhaps linked to the cycles of the sun or the souls of the dead. Whatever the truth, the tower stands today as one of the oldest monumental structures on Earth. Its presence tells us something quiet but profound, that even in these earliest moments of urban life, people were dreaming of more than survival. They were dreaming of permanence, and in the small compact houses surrounding the tower, life moved to a quiet rhythm. Children played in the dust, grandparents watched the seasons change. Seeds were planted, harvested, and shared. The people of Jericho gathered around the spring, not just to drink, but to speak, to mourn, to celebrate, and perhaps to wonder what else lay beyond the circle of their lives. With no metal tools, no pottery, and no script, they still managed to change the landscape forever. And Jericho continued to grow. Its people developed new ways of organizing their labor, new strategies for preserving food, and even hints of social hierarchy. The dead were buried beneath the floors of homes, often with strange care, heads removed, skulls plastered with clay to recreate the features of the living. These were not the acts of a people indifferent to memory. They were remembering, they were anchoring themselves to their past, and all the while, the spring kept flowing. The skulls, with their carefully molded faces, are among the strangest and most intimate relics ever found in Jericho. Discovered nestled beneath the floors of ancient homes, these human heads, sometimes buried singly, sometimes in small groups, were covered with fine layers of plaster, carefully shaped by hand to recreate cheeks, brows, noses, and lips. Shells were placed where the eyes once were. In some, the jaw was reconstructed. In others, the features seemed almost stylized, softened by the weight of time but still unmistakably human. What did they mean to the people who shaped them? Perhaps they were a form of ancestor worship, a way of keeping the dead close, literally beneath one's feet, part of the daily rhythm of family life. Perhaps they were meant to protect the living, or to hold on to wisdom passed down through generations. Or perhaps they served as a gentle reminder of who came before, in a world where permanence was still a fragile idea. These early Neolithic people, though long silent, speak through gestures like these, through the way they tended the dead, built up their homes in layers, and placed offerings in the earth. Their lives are distant from ours in years, but not in spirit. They had no writing system to pass down their thoughts, no great temples carved in stone, and yet their actions layered in dust and silence speak of something profound, a belief that life was meant to continue, that there was value in staying, building, remembering, and returning. And so Jericho grew, layer by layer, each generation built atop the last. Over centuries, mud brick homes were leveled and built over, walls reformed, and the tower, still standing in its circular stillness, remained as the silent center of it all. The tell or mound we see today is not a natural hill, but the result of these centuries of quiet labor. It is a mountain of memory. By around 8000 BCE, the community began to change again. Slowly, carefully, people began to experiment with new forms of building, rectangular homes, larger storage areas, open courtyards. Trade networks began to develop, linking Jericho to other early settlements far across the Fertile Crescent. From the hills of Anatolia to the plains of Syria, from the shores of the Levant to the edges of the great Tigris and Euphrates, a great slow current of change was underway. It wasn't a revolution, not in the way we usually think of that word. It was quiet, like water reshaping stone, a long unfolding of new ideas, new ways of living, and new questions about what it meant to be human. The people of Jericho no longer moved with the seasons. Their lives were tied to fields, to families, to the gentle rise and fall of days lived in one place. And though many of their traditions still echoed the past, others were entirely new. Animals were now kept in pens, sheep, goats, and eventually cattle. Clay vessels began to appear, the beginnings of pottery. Houses grew more spacious, more deliberate, and slowly, inevitably, the balance of the world tipped. For the first time in human history, more people began to live in permanent settlements than in nomadic bands. Cities, true cities, were still far off, but the foundation had been laid. Jericho by then was already ancient. Its people had been born and buried in the same dust for over 1,000 years, and still the spring flowed, still the walls rose, still each generation looked back, remembered, and looked forward again. And so we return again to the edge of a soft green oasis, under the early warmth of the Levantine sun, where the first light creeps gently across the dust-mottled stone of an ancient hill, a hill that isn't a hill at all. From a distance, Tel es Sultan appears natural, rising as it does from the desert like a quiet monument to time. But as we draw nearer, we see it more clearly for what it is, layer upon layer, age upon age of collapsed walls, fallen hearths, worn thresholds, the memory of thousands who once called it home. Beneath our feet, their lives lie sealed in earth and memory. By the time Kathleen Kenyon's excavation crew had cleared enough of the Tell's stratified puzzle, they had descended through time itself, uncovering not just homes and hearths, but entire ways of life once thought impossible, so early in human history. What they found stunned even the most skeptical archaeologists of the day. The earliest layers were not from the Bronze Age, as expected. They weren't even from the Copper Age. They were far older, deep into the Neolithic, and perhaps beyond. Here the earth whispered a story of a village before villages, where people gathered in the dawn of memory, huddled in round mud brick homes, built in clusters, each hut with walls half sunk into the ground to insulate against heat and cold, with thatched roofs made of reeds and bundled grass. Traces of fire pits and storage bins still sat quietly in the soil. Charred seeds, pulses and bone fragments lay undisturbed until uncovered by cautious hands. One could almost feel the stillness of those homes, as if the families who once tended their hearths had only just stepped out. And yet, this place, it was not simply a cluster of homes, it was something more. Around the same period, perhaps a little earlier, someone, or perhaps many, began to build something that would change how humans lived forever. A structure like no other known from its time, a tower. Today this tower rests at the foot of Tel Es Sultan, quiet and worn, half consumed by the layers of time. But when it was new, some 10,000 years ago, it rose with purpose and meaning. Measuring over 8 meters high and 20 in diameter, built from stone with an inner staircase that wound upward through its heart, it stood like a sentinel over the village. Its purpose remains mysterious. Was it a watchtower, a defensive post, a ritual monument, a gathering point for ceremonies at dawn? We can only guess, but what we do know is this: it took organized effort to build, shared labor, vision, cooperation, and trust. This wasn't the work of a lone builder, this was the work of a people, and that, more than anything, may be what sets Jericho apart. Not its walls, not its age, not even its continuous habitation, but the simple fact that so long ago, in the deep prehistory of humankind, people came together here, not just to survive, but to build something enduring. They shared food, raised children, buried their dead with care, and passed on stories we can no longer hear, but we can still see the echo of their lives, etched into stone and soil. And so, night after night, the story of Jericho unfolds, slowly, carefully, like pages turned by a gentle breeze. And in these quiet moments, we step deeper into the cradle of cities, where once there were none. Beneath the pale light of a new moon, the landscape softens. The hills around Jericho breathe with ancient silence, and the stones laid by long-forgotten hands seem to glow faintly in the night. Everything feels hushed and close, as though the land remembers. By now, the Neolithic village at Tel Sultan had grown into something more than a settlement. What had begun as scattered homes near a constant spring was now becoming one of the first truly organized communities in the world. But the real transformation, the step from temporary settlement to city, lay not just in numbers but in something quieter. It was in the rhythm of days, in the daily return from fields and groves, the shaping of clay in call-used hands, the sound of grindstones turning seeds into flour, in the faint murmur of voices under reed-thatched roofs, and in the care shown to the dead. Because here at Jericho, there was something extraordinary found buried beneath the floors of homes: skulls, human skulls, carefully arranged and treated with what seemed to be profound reverence. Some had been modeled over with plaster, reshaped into human features. Seashells were pressed into eye sockets, staring forever forward. Thin layers of ochre still clung to cheekbones and brows. It was as though the departed had never quite left. They were remembered, perhaps even honored, with artistry and presence. No longer simply placed in the earth and forgotten, these ancestors were brought into the heart of the home, under the very floor where children played, where families ate, and where stories were told by firelight. It is hard not to wonder what it meant. Did these people believe their ancestors watched over them? Were the dead guardians of the household, symbols of continuity, passed from one generation to the next? Or were they something even more mysterious, part of a ritual we no longer understand? Whatever the answer, it shows a kind of care, a link between past and present, and it tells us that the people of Jericho, 10,000 years ago, had already begun to see themselves not only as individuals, but as part of something larger. A people, a lineage, a shared story. And where there is story, there is memory. Where there is memory, there is culture. And from culture, cities begin to rise. But these early builders didn't stop with skulls and shrines. They shaped their world with every season. Fields stretched outward from the spring-fed heart of the village. Chickpeas, barley, wheat, and lentils, harvested by hand, stored in jars, and traded with others who wandered in from nearby valleys. Sheep and goats began to appear more often in the archaeological record, not as game, but as livestock, herded, fed, bred, and kept close. And with food came surplus. With surplus, time. And with time came specialization. Not everyone needed to hunt anymore. Not everyone needed to gather. There was room at last for someone to weave baskets, to mold pots, to shape tools from stone, or to prepare the dead. The social tapestry of Jericho became richer and more intricate. One might imagine quiet mornings before the heat rose, when elders gathered under palm shade to pass on memories. Children ran between houses, and the air carried the scent of crushed herbs and baked bread. In those days, the city grew slowly, organically, ringing outward from the spring like ripples in still water. And in each ring, a new generation, a little taller, a little wiser, with roots a little deeper in the soil. They did not know they were building history, they only knew they were building home. By now, the memory of the first fires, the first walls, and the first careful harvests was already fading from living memory. Generations had passed, hundreds of seasons had turned the fields golden and green again. The city of Jericho had quietly become something permanent, something lasting. To the people living there, it was simply life. Waking each morning to the cool breath of the hills, walking barefoot on beaten earth paths smoothed by centuries of footsteps, drawing water from the ever-giving spring that had never once dried, not even in the hottest days. To them, the tower that rose in the heart of the settlement had always been there. This strange and ancient structure, tall, round, stone-built, may have once marked a moment of innovation, or even a gathering place. But now, it was simply part of the landscape, a place where children played in its long shadow, where elders sat in its shade, where winds whispered through its narrow stairs. But it was still unlike anything else in the world. At 10,000 years old, this tower remains one of the earliest known examples of monumental architecture. Over 8 meters tall, with an internal staircase that wound quietly through its core, it was more than just a curiosity. It was a sign that something had changed, that the people of Jericho were beginning to think not just of survival, but of time. They had begun to build for the future. Not just huts that might last a season, or granaries to feed the next harvest, but stone monuments meant to endure. Perhaps they were designed to keep watch, or to measure shadows as the sun passed through the sky. Perhaps they were ritual spaces, places where the village gathered to mark the passing of years. We may never know for certain, but what we do know is this. Someone, thousands of years ago, imagined something that had never existed, and then made it real. That is the spirit of a city. The people of Jericho had, by this point, begun to shape the very world around them. They built retaining walls to hold up their terraces, dug irrigation channels to guide water through their fields, laid out walkways between their dwellings. The homes themselves had changed too, becoming rounder, sturdier, often half sunk into the earth for insulation, with smooth lime-plastered floors that would have gleamed white in the morning sun. And underneath those floors, again and again, they placed their ancestors. The bones of the dead were not cast aside or burned, but arranged carefully, sometimes with heads removed and preserved separately in ornate ways, as if the mind itself had to be remembered. It is impossible to know what prayers were whispered as these skulls were buried. Perhaps they asked the ancestors for protection. Perhaps they saw themselves as part of an unbroken chain, one that began long before and would stretch far into the future. In the silence of those burial chambers, memory and presence seemed to become one. Above ground, life continued. Quietly, steadily, patiently. The city was no longer simply surviving, it was adapting. We see this in the tools they made, in the materials they imported from far away, obsidian from Anatolia, seashells from distant coasts, stones and pigments not native to the region. Jericho had become a place of exchange, not just of goods but of ideas, and the people who lived here carried those ideas with them as they traveled beyond the Jordan Valley, seeding the knowledge of agriculture, of architecture, and of ritual into new lands. It is strange to think of such an ancient place being already old in its own time, and yet, even then its roots were growing deeper. The walls, the tower, the quiet floors below ground, they all whispered of something lasting, a promise perhaps, that human hands when guided by memory and need could shape something that endures, even here, in a place where time seems to bend, and the spring never runs dry. In the long, slow passage of centuries, what begins as innovation becomes tradition. What once startled becomes familiar, and what is familiar, over time, fades softly into the rhythm of life. So it was with Jericho. The people who lived there no longer marveled at the tower that cast its morning shadow over the soft, chalk-colored homes. It had simply always been there, like the spring, like the hills, like the stars above. But beneath this calm surface, a quiet transformation was still unfolding. You can see it in the soil. The once wild grains, gathered by hand so long ago, now bore signs of change. Barley kernels had grown fatter, tougher. Wheat, too, began to yield more predictably. It hadn't happened all at once, nor had it been done with knowledge of genes or biology. But over thousands of harvests, year after year, the people of Jericho had begun to shape the plants themselves, selecting, nurturing, replanting. Domestication not as an invention, but as a quiet partnership, and with it came change. More reliable harvests meant more people could live together in one place, more mouths to feed, but also more hands to help, more time to learn, more chances to specialize, and with specialization came craft. In the layers of soil at Tel Sultan, archaeologists have found delicate beads made of shell, and fragments of finely worked flint blades. Not just tools for survival, but objects of beauty, signs of a mind that could look beyond need and imagine something more. You can imagine one of those craftsmen sitting quietly under a fig tree, turning a soft piece of limestone in his hand, carving it into the shape of a bird, or a symbol, or a charm to hang from a thread. Not far off, a woman crushes dried herbs in a stone bowl, mixing them with oils to store for the seasons ahead. A child chases a goat through a patch of dusty grass, and overhead, a flock of ibises drift across the pale blue sky, the same sky that has watched over this land since the ice last receded. This was no longer just a gathering of homes, it was a society with memory, with patterns, with choices. The people of Jericho had begun to understand the landscape, not just as something to survive in, but as something they could shape. Terraces built into hillsides captured the runoff of winter rains. Storage pits were carved into rock, lined with plaster, sealed with clay. These were not the short-term improvisations of wandering bands. They were the careful strategies of people who knew they were staying, people who had learned to listen to the land, who had studied its rhythms, its floods, its seasons, who had learned which seeds to plant, and when, which animals could be kept, which rocks made better walls, and so they built. The walls of Jericho, so often mythologized, had not been designed as fortifications in the way we think of today. They were likely more than that, retaining walls, flood defenses, perhaps ritual boundaries. But whatever their original purpose, they were yet another sign. A city was being born, not in sudden thunder, but in quiet, slow accumulation, in repeated actions, in remembered places, in stories passed from mother to daughter, from grandfather to grandson. And perhaps, in the stillness of night, someone once sat outside their home, beneath a crescent moon, and wondered, what will this place be 1,000 years from now? What will they say of us? If only they could have known. Even 10,000 years later, people would still speak the name Jericho. There are moments in history that do not arrive with noise or triumph, but rather drift in, soft as the desert wind. In Jericho, change had never been sudden. It crept in slowly, layer by layer, season by season. And so the next great shift in the story of this ancient place arrived much the same way, quietly, gently, almost imperceptibly. It began with clay. In earlier generations, the people of Jericho had shaped their homes from mud, mixing earth and water with straw, then patting it into soft bricks, dried under the sun. But now, slowly, something new was taking form. The hearths grew deeper. The air in the workshops carried a sharper scent, and low domed ovens began to appear near the edges of homes. For the first time, fire was being used not just to warm or cook, but to transform. In the soft red glow of these ovens, clay hardened into pottery. Simple bowls at first, thick-walled, undecorated, but bowls that lasted longer, bowls that didn't leak, that could be sealed, that could be carried. Pottery. To us it may not seem like much, but for Jericho, and for the world beyond, it marked a new chapter. No longer were possessions fleeting or fragile. They could be stored, traded, passed down. The shapes were modest, rounded bellies, narrow rims, coarse surfaces, but they were more than just containers. They were a sign of thought, of foresight, of permanence. In time, those plain bowls would evolve. Decorations would be scratched or painted, handles would be added, and each style, each little mark, would tell something of the people who made it. But even at the beginning, the invention of pottery was a whisper of something deeper, that humans were settling not just their bodies, but their cultures, that here in Jericho, people were not just living, but beginning to tell their stories through the objects they made. You can almost picture the first potter, hands dark with clay, crouched beside the fire, watching the flames, waiting, not yet knowing that they were holding the future. Outside the workshop, life moved slowly forward. Children fetched water from the spring, carrying it in goatskin bags. Women tended to the granaries, cool, shaded rooms lined with woven baskets filled with barley and emmer wheat. Shepherds returned with flocks at dusk, their calls echoing across the slopes. Smoke curled from hearths, dogs barked in the distance, and the sun dipped below the hills, just as it had for centuries. The same sun that had warmed their ancestors, the same sun that would watch their descendants rise. In the darkness, the homes of Jericho glowed with small flames. People gathered, stories were shared, meals were eaten, and somewhere in the night, perhaps a child asked, "Where did we come from? How long have we been here?" And someone older, soft-voiced, with eyes half closed, answered with a slow smile, "We have always been here." Of course that wasn't quite true, but it felt true, because to them, the layers of earth beneath their feet weren't just soil, they were memory. And as pottery spread from Jericho into the wider world, so too did that memory. One jar, one shard, one fingerprint at a time. As dawn returned to the valley of Jericho, the first light touched the round, mud-plastered rooftops with a gentle golden warmth. The air was still and soft. Just beyond the edge of the spring-fed fields, long grasses swayed in the hush of early morning. Birds called to one another from the tamarisk trees. Their voices, small but bright, carried on the cool desert air. And inside the sleeping city, one by one, fires were rekindled. In the quiet corners of homes where families had slept beneath reed mats and skins, someone rose first, perhaps a mother or elder, moving with practiced stillness. The ashes of the night's cooking fire were gently stirred, coals fanned into soft orange light. A pot was set above them, water and grain within. A new day had begun. But though each sunrise in Jericho brought its own rhythm of life, tending to crops, feeding animals, repairing walls, weaving, grinding grain, something else now stirred beneath the surface. It was not a thing one could touch or name, not yet, but it was growing all the same, a current of change, a restlessness, a whisper of distance. People were beginning to move. Across the greater fertile crescent, from the green slopes of the Taurus Mountains to the long valleys beside the Euphrates, other settlements had risen. They were smaller than Jericho, younger perhaps, but no less determined. And now, slowly, a pattern emerged. Families packed bundles, hunters followed new herds, traders, yes, true traders, began to carry with them baskets of salt, obsidian, dried fish, and for the first time, pottery from Jericho. Those simple vessels, coarse and plain, had become tokens of a new kind of life. They passed from hand to hand, from town to town, and with them went stories, customs, ideas. Jericho was no longer alone. Still, it remained something more than just a settlement. The city, if we dare to use that word so early, had become a place of reference, a point on the land where memory had weight. People remembered the spring that never dried, the walls older than any elder's words, the tower that stood against time. And so, as people came and went, they sometimes returned, or sent their children to return, or simply spoke of Jericho, with reverence. But even reverence cannot hold back the world. With greater contact between distant groups came new seeds, both literal and figurative. From the north, strangers brought barley varieties unfamiliar to the valley. New tools arrived, more refined flint blades, polished stone axes, and beads carved from shell and bone. With these came ideas about burial, about family, about the spirit world, shaped by landscapes far away. And little by little, the people of Jericho began to change. They still built their homes from mud brick, still gathered around fires, still gave thanks to the spring that nourished them. But something deeper was stirring now, beneath the hearth, beneath the soil, beneath the mind. Community was evolving. Where once a dozen families may have formed a single band, sharing all and knowing each other's stories by heart, now came the beginnings of roles, of leadership, of identity beyond the kin. It is difficult to mark this shift, and archaeologists still debate how and when it took place. But one thing is clear, in Jericho's middle Neolithic layers, we begin to see new structures, rooms with floors of polished plaster, compartments carved into the walls, storerooms with locks, and graves, not scattered and shallow like in earlier times, but gathered now, beneath homes, beside doorways, even within sacred places, carefully prepared, often adorned with beads, tools or bones of animals. Sometimes the skulls were removed, and not discarded, but preserved, painted with ochre, reshaped with clay, their features modeled again as if to remember, as if to hold a piece of the person close, even after death. These were not merely funerary customs, they were signs of a shift in how people understood themselves, not just as members of a group, but as individuals, as ancestors, as parts of a lineage. And so, in this sun-warmed valley beneath the desert mountains, Jericho gave rise to something greater than architecture or walls. It gave rise to memory, to the shaping of the past, not just through storytelling, but through ritual, through clay, through acts of preservation. and perhaps on certain nights, when the stars returned to the sky, and the wind passed softly through the trees, a child would look to the horizon and ask, who were they? And someone older, someone who remembered, might reply, they were us, before us, and now, we remember. And so it was that the first city on earth became something more than a place, it became an idea. As night fell once more over the desert valley, Jericho lay quiet beneath the stars. The warmth of the day faded slowly, the stones of the pathways holding on to the sun's memory just a little longer. In the sky above, the first stars twinkled like distant lamps hung across the heavens, each one quiet, each one ancient. Fires flickered in the hollows of homes, their amber glow casting soft patterns across the plastered walls. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then settled. A child murmured in their sleep. The city, like all living things, exhaled into the stillness of night, and beneath that stillness, the city remembered. For now, in the long arc of its history, Jericho had become more than survival. Its people were no longer merely finding food, building walls, or securing water. They were beginning to shape their world with intention, with imagination, and slowly the city was filling with symbols. Some were small, patterns etched into beads, lines scored into clay, a spiral here, a zigzag there, marks that meant something, perhaps to the maker, perhaps to the group, perhaps both. Other symbols were far more grand. In the center of one of the older houses, archaeologists discovered a floor meticulously rebuilt again and again over the course of generations, each new layer plastered over the last, each one smoother, more refined, more symmetrical. It was more than simple maintenance. It was something sacred, something practiced, a ritual of continuity, and in some of these floors, strange hollows had been carved, carefully measured. Pits not used for food storage, nor for waste. Some contained nothing at all. Others held the remains of ancestors, folded gently beneath the threshold of the living. These were not coincidences. They were choices. In these buried bones and painted skulls, the people of Jericho were beginning to shape something invisible, something powerful. A shared memory, a shared meaning. And so the city took on a second life, one not built of mud brick and stone but of thought and story and symbol. A city not of walls, but of connections. Some say the earliest forms of religion were born here. Not in temples, but in acts, in the way the dead were treated, in the objects left behind, in the reverence shown to things that could not be touched. But religion, if it existed in Jericho then, was not like the great faiths that would come later. There were no sacred texts, no vast priesthoods, no temples of carved stone. Instead, it may have lived in whispers, in gestures, in songs sung while grinding grain, in tokens placed in graves, in silent pauses before stepping over a buried ancestor's resting place, in reverence, not doctrine. Still, questions would have lingered, softly, like the wind in the palms. Where do we go when we die? What happens to the spirit? Why does the spring never dry? These were questions that could not be answered through tool-making or planting seed. They required imagination, belief. And so belief slowly settled into the foundations of the city, just as surely as the bricks did. And as belief took root, so too did something else. Art, simple, at first. Lines drawn into wet clay, pebbles arranged into patterns, bits of colored stone sewn into clothing, or worn around the neck. Later, the people of Jericho began to create figures, small statues, human-shaped. Some were smooth and abstract, rounded forms without eyes or mouths. Others showed breasts and hips, rounded bellies, long arms. Some stood alone, others in groups. No one can say exactly what they meant. Were they symbols of fertility, ancestors, gods, spirits of the spring, or were they simply stories, shaped by hand? Whatever their purpose, they reveal a truth we can still recognize. The people of Jericho were not just surviving, they were imagining. And perhaps, one quiet evening, a mother handed a small clay figure to her child. And as the child turned it over in their hands, felt the warmth of the fire nearby, heard the slow trickle of water in the channel outside, a new story began to take root. Not written, not recorded, but remembered, passed from one voice to the next. This is how cities become more than stone. This is how memory becomes myth. And so, as the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and sleep settled upon the first city, its people rested not only in safety and sustenance, but in story. Stories shaped their homes, their past, their place in the world, and those stories, those quiet seeds, would one day become the roots of civilization itself. At the edge of the ancient city, where the desert grasses whisper in the breeze and the air carries a fine golden dust, time itself seems to slow. The spring still murmurs, flowing steadily through the heart of the oasis, and though thousands of years have passed, the earth here remembers, in the gentle curve of a hillside, where Tel Sultan rises, there are layers beneath layers, stories not just stacked in time, but pressed into the very soil. Beneath every crumbled wall, every buried tool, every weathered shard of plaster, lies the echo of a hand, a footstep, a life once lived. It was in this landscape, where permanence had once seemed impossible, that the people of Jericho began to deepen their roots. Farming, once a seasonal act of trial and error, was now central to daily life. The fields that unfolded beyond the mud-brick walls grew dense with barley and wheat. Domesticated goats grazed under the sun, their soft bleats rising with the dawn. Sheep wandered in groups, herded by boys who whistled and hummed quiet songs their grandfathers had taught them. The houses, too, were changing. Round homes gave way to rectangles. Hearths were carefully placed in corners now, close to where children slept, and stories were told. Rooms became more defined, and with them, the idea of spaces with purpose. One room for food, another for tools, another for sleep. Outside, the city buzzed in its quiet way. Women ground grain on stone slabs, their arms moving in practiced rhythm. Men repaired walls, trimmed reeds, gathered salt from the nearby flats. Children played with pebbles, splashing water into the air from the spring, their laughter echoing along the canals. It was not a city of kings or wars or towering monuments. It was a city of ordinary miracles, a city where people had learned to coax life from the land, to feed their children, care for their dead, and shelter themselves from the shifting world around them. A place where survival had become stability, and where stability was beginning to give birth to culture. One of the most striking things found in the deepest layers of Jericho was not a building or a tool, but a face. More accurately, it was a skull, an ancient human skull, carefully plastered and painted, with shells inserted into the eye sockets to give it a lifelike gaze. The expression was serene, thoughtful, watching. It was not alone. Several such skulls were uncovered, each one unique. Some wore red ochre across the forehead, others had traces of paint on the cheeks or lips. They had been kept, curated, perhaps even displayed. They were not buried with the body, but preserved, suggesting that the people of Jericho had begun to honor their ancestors in new ways. Perhaps they believed the spirits of the dead still watched over the living. Perhaps they were venerated, asked for guidance, remembered not as loss but as presence. It's possible these skulls rested in homes, displayed above hearths or on shelves of clay. Perhaps they were brought out during rituals or gatherings. Perhaps the children in the village learned the names of these ancestors by heart. We cannot know for certain, but we do know this: they were cherished, protected, given the time and care of the living, long after death had passed. And in this care, we see something deeply human: the desire to remember, the desire to connect, the understanding that we are not only our own lives, but the continuation of others, and the beginning of those yet to come. In this sense, Jericho was more than a city. It was a memory made visible, a quiet promise passed down from hand to hand, from voice to voice, that life here would go on, that even in the stillness of death, something sacred would endure. Outside the walls, the desert rolled on in every direction, harsh, unforgiving, filled with danger. But inside, within the soft boundaries of the city, there was water, there was grain, there was laughter, and story and love. There was time enough to imagine the future, and beneath it all, the spring that never dried. As the moon rose gently over the Jordan Valley, casting silver shadows across the walls of Tel Sultan, the people of Jericho once again settled into the rhythms of another ancient night. Smoke curled lazily from the flat rooftops, carrying with it the scent of roasted grain, herbs, and clay. The city breathed, not with noise or commotion, but with the quiet hush of countless lives flowing in harmony with the land. By now the city had grown beyond the immediate spring. Footpaths were pressed into the ground by daily passage, worn smooth by feet carrying baskets of wheat, by water jars balanced on hips, and by those simply wandering, letting the evening wind cool their sun-warmed skin. Jericho was not just a place of survival anymore. It had become a place of rhythm. Seasons passed in long, steady cycles. Spring brought new planting and fresh shoots. Summer meant careful irrigation and labor beneath a golden sky. Autumn was harvest and celebration, with figs sweetening in the palms and olives thick on the branches. Winter, though mild compared to the mountains to the west, brought its own hush, cool nights, long conversations, the mending of nets, and the telling of stories. And always, there was the spring, that ever-dependable trickle of water, ancient even then, which rose from the rocks, like a whispered secret. It fed the fields, the animals, the people, and perhaps, in some quiet way, their spirit. For as long as memory stretched, it had never stopped. And so, year after year, generation after generation, people remained. In those quiet winters, with the rains softening the earth and the skies hanging low with clouds, the city turned inward. Inside their warm mud-brick homes, people created things. They shaped beads from shell and stone, stringing them into necklaces. They carved bone into tools, and sometimes into tiny figurines. They began painting their walls, patterns of red and black, repeating lines and handprints, spirals and sunbursts, meaningful perhaps, or simply beautiful. No one knows for sure, but their presence speaks of something deeper, a desire not just to live, but to express, to mark a space and say, "We are here." And as homes became more permanent, so too did the structures of community. Some rooms were larger than others, not for kings or nobles. Jericho had none, but perhaps for gatherings, for the telling of news, the sharing of food, the whispering of secrets. Clay ovens, storage bins, stone grinders, all arranged with care and familiarity. These people understood their world intimately, not through books or tablets, but through the rhythm of seasons, the feel of soil, and the shared work of living side by side. Outside, beyond the cultivated fields, the wild still pressed close. Jackals called in the distance. Thorny scrublands stretched toward the Dead Sea. The desert winds carried with them the smell of salt and dust. It was not an easy world, and yet Jericho had endured, not through dominance, but through patience, through water, through the land. Even today, modern archaeologists wandering the ancient ruins have found themselves struck by the stillness of the place, a stillness not empty, but full of memory, of ancient breath, of whispered lives tucked beneath layers of dust. The silence of Tel Sultan is the silence of 1,000 lifetimes gently woven into earth, and in this silence, one can almost imagine the sound of grinding stones, the soft tread of sandaled feet, the giggle of a child chasing shadows at dusk. One can imagine the stories told in low voices, the worries shared, the dreams passed from one mind to another, all under the same watching stars. Because Jericho was never just about the walls, it was about the spaces between them, the warmth of clay held in the palm, the scent of damp earth in morning, the way a mother might hush a crying child with a song older than memory. It was a city not made of stone, but of people, people who built, and planted, and remembered, people who honored their dead with care and tenderness, who looked at the sun and saw not a god to fear, but a day to work, to love, to rest. And always, as the city drifted into night, the water still ran, down from the hidden aquifers, up through the sacred spring, trickling through the reeds, winding its way between hearths and homes, a quiet, unending thread, tying past to present, the spring that never dried. Long before cities were crowned by towering palaces or guarded by the swords of kings, there was Jericho, a place not of grandeur, but of gentle persistence. And as the centuries unfurled like a scroll of clay and dust, this small city near the eternal spring continued to breathe softly beneath the gaze of the rising sun. Each morning, the light would spill over the eastern ridges, illuminating the valley with a soft golden hue. Shadows of palm fronds danced on plastered walls. The dew glistened faintly on the woven mats laid out to dry grain, and slowly the city would stir. Not with the sharp clang of metal or the shouting of soldiers, but with the rustle of straw, the low murmurs of waking voices, and the steady rhythm of life returning to motion. Within these ancient walls, the days passed not in urgency, but in the calm rituals of survival. A woman kneels beside a basin, crushing wild barley into flour with a flat stone, her arms moving in time with the rhythm passed down from countless grandmothers. A boy walks toward the edge of the orchard with a clay jar under one arm, glancing up at the birds rustling the fig leaves overhead. A small group of elders sits in the shade, hands working a net from tightly twisted fibers, speaking of the weather, the earth, and small mysteries they've known since youth. It is easy to forget, in our hurried modern world, that a city like Jericho could thrive for centuries without conquest, without vast walls of marble, or elaborate scrolls of law. What held the people here was not power, it was place. The spring still flowed. The fields, once coaxed from stony soil, now ripened like old friends. The goats wandered familiar paths, The walls were patched and smoothed by practiced hands, not for beauty or pride, but because they were needed, because they worked. Jericho's people didn't live in history, they lived in seasons, and season by season they wove their lives into the land. There was no written record, not yet, but there were stories. Spoken at twilight, when the fires crackled low, and children leaned against their mothers, eyes wide. Tales of the ancestors who first followed the spring, of the thunder spirits in the mountains, of the long dry years when the wind tasted of salt and nothing grew, of the time when the tower was built, one stone at a time, reaching upward like a question asked to the sky. The tower, still partially standing, remains one of the most haunting features of old Jericho. Its exact purpose is still unknown. Was it a monument, a place to watch the stars, a gathering spot, a defense against something now long forgotten? We can only guess. But what's certain is this: someone long ago looked up from the earth and decided to build, and others joined them. One stone, then another, hands working together, year after year. And in that act, however small or great its purpose, they left something behind, something solid, something enduring. The people of Jericho didn't live in grand palaces, but their lives had a quiet grace. They didn't write books, but they remembered. They didn't carve empires, but they shaped a world where water, sun, and time were all honored, where death was not feared but prepared for, with the same care one might give to planting a field. Underneath many homes, archaeologists discovered buried skulls, placed with intention beneath packed earth floors, sometimes covered with plaster, the faces modeled again in clay. It is one of the city's most mysterious customs. Perhaps these were ancestors, remembered and kept close. Perhaps they were symbols of protection, or vessels for stories long since forgotten. In these small acts, planting, cooking, burying, building, the city endured. Quietly, steadily. It is humbling to think that while so many later civilizations rose and fell in storms of ambition, Jericho simply remained. Through droughts and rain, through silence and song, through birth and return. Its people didn't try to conquer the world, they tried to live in it. And now, thousands of years later, their lives speak across the void, not through words but through presence. The shape of a tool, the curve of a stair, the worn stone where so many feet once passed. Their stories have softened with time, blurred like the outlines of a mountain seen through morning mist. But in that gentle blur, something essential still shines through. Jericho was not just the first city, it was the first memory of what a city could be. A place where people came not to escape the world, but to live within it, to gather by water, to build from earth, to sing beneath stars. And still today, if you were to sit beside the old spring at night and close your eyes, you might hear something. Not the sounds of the past, but the feeling of it. A whisper of footsteps, a lullaby in a forgotten tongue. The hush of water, still flowing. The breath of a city that never truly slept, the spring that never dried. In the quiet dawns and fading dusks of Jericho, the same questions once stirred in the hearts of its people that still stir in ours today, though spoken in a different tongue, and shaped by a world far older than our own. Why are we here? Where do we come from? What is remembered when we are gone? They did not write these thoughts in stone or ink, but they answered in the language they knew best, through the laying of hands on sun-baked bricks, through careful tending of soil, and through the rituals repeated each day with the same gentle persistence as the rising sun. For as long as the spring flowed, Jericho continued, though centuries passed and the city changed. Houses rebuilt, walls repaired, customs evolving like the slow curl of a fern unfurling in the shade, the soul of the place stayed constant. It remained anchored by water, by memory, and by a reverence for the land that gave them life. There was no ruler, as we think of rulers, no throne, no crown, no laws etched into tablets. Power in Jericho was likely shared, distributed through custom, through experience, through those whose wisdom was worn into them, like the smooth handles of the oldest tools. Elders spoke not to command, but to remind. Their authority came not from force, but from memory. And memory, in Jericho, lived in everything. In the way seeds were saved from the best crops, in the particular slope of a field that always yielded well, in the stories whispered at night about the stars above and the ancestors beneath. The people lived with their dead, not in fear, but in familiarity. As homes were built, the remains of loved ones were buried beneath the floors, wrapped in care, sometimes accompanied by tokens of their life. In this way, each house became a vessel for memory, a sanctuary for both the living and those who came before. You might imagine a child learning to walk above the resting place of her grandmother, a father grinding grain beside the remains of his own father, generations layered not only in time but in space, all held together by walls of clay and breath and care. It was not a haunted place, it was a held place, and when storms rolled in from the desert, or droughts pressed hard on the valley, the people did not scatter. They repaired what needed repair, they rationed, they remembered that the spring had never failed, and that was enough. This enduring rhythm, lived out year after year, gave Jericho a kind of timelessness, and yet even Jericho could not remain unchanged. Far beyond the valley, in the hills and plains of what we now call the Fertile Crescent, change was stirring. People began to work copper into tools, herds grew larger, trade routes stretched farther, and slowly, the world became more connected. Ideas traveled, as did strangers. Jericho saw them. Traders, pilgrims, perhaps even wanderers seeking the spring whispered of in distant villages. Some came and stayed. Others brought with them new seeds, new songs, new customs. The city absorbed them gently, as it always had, not resisting change, but shaping it to its own rhythm. For Jericho's greatness was never in its size, it was in its endurance, in its ability to remain, a quiet knot in the fabric of human history, tying together the old ways with the new. And though centuries would pass, and the old city would eventually be abandoned, its spirit never quite disappeared. Later people returned to its ruins, built atop its layers, made homes where the spring still ran. Again and again, across millennia, humans found their way back to Jericho, drawn not by conquest or wealth, but by something deeper, a familiarity, a presence, a memory held in earth. And when modern archaeologists first dug into the soil at Tel Sultan, peeling back layers like pages in a forgotten book, they uncovered more than stones. They uncovered lives, layer upon layer of lives, each one faint, but present, each one adding to the quiet chorus of a city that had outlived time. It is humbling to know that the place still stands, that you can still walk where they once walked, that the spring still bubbles up, clear and cool, that even in a world of steel and glass and satellites, there remains a quiet mound of earth near the Jordan River, where the past still speaks. Softly, clearly, eternally, and always in the background, the spring that never dried. Long after the last Neolithic house had been abandoned, and long after the tools of flint and obsidian had given way to copper and bronze, Jericho still held its place upon the land. As centuries blurred into millennia, new peoples arrived, each one layering their own way of life atop the dust and memories of the old. Canaanites, Israelites, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, each came with their own gods, their own walls, their own stories, and yet the spring flowed just the same. They called the place by different names, they raised different banners, they etched different marks into stone, but the land beneath remained the same, and always, the whisper of those earliest inhabitants seemed to linger, just beyond hearing, like the faintest footprint in dried mud, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be understood. You might picture it now, a Greek merchant walking the ruins of some ancient wall, his sandals brushing stones that once supported a tower thousands of years older than his own ancestors. He doesn't know the story of the people who built it, but he knows that someone did, and he pauses, and that pause, that moment of wonder, is the thread that connects him to us, because Jericho reminds us that history is not just what we know, it is also what we feel. In the gentle curve of a hillside that once held homes, in the silence of a collapsed wall where children once laughed, in the rhythm of a spring that has never failed. When the Romans arrived, they too settled the area. The site shifted, as it always had. New buildings rose, aqueducts were constructed, and the desert again was made green through irrigation. And though much of the ancient city had by then become a quiet mound, the spring kept flowing. It always had. Even during the centuries when Jericho was nearly forgotten, mentioned only in passing by distant scribes, or visited only by herders and farmers, something of it persisted. It never became a myth. It was always too real for that. Archaeologists like Kathleen Kenyon did not unearth a dream. They unearthed rooms, walls, floors, spaces where real people had lived real lives. They found seeds stored for winter, tools worn smooth by years of use, and bones gently tucked beneath homes. These weren't relics of legends, these were moments from everyday life, from people who worried, who hoped, who shared, who grieved. And maybe that's the most powerful thing Jericho offers us. Not tales of kings or empires, but echoes of ordinary days. A woman drawing water from the spring before sunrise, a child kneeling beside her, tracing lines in the dust, a man mending a broken roof, while birds flit through the orchard trees. They may be gone, but they're not lost. Their stories still speak to us, not loudly, not with grandeur, but in the soft cadence of continuity, in the slow, steady rhythm of a place that has never stopped being lived in. Even now, the modern city of Jericho rests nearby. Life continues. People still walk the dusty paths near Tel es Sultan. Date palms still cast shadows across the fields, and the spring, as always, still sings its quiet song beneath the earth. Perhaps that is the lesson of Jericho. That endurance is not made of stone alone. That legacy is not about monuments. That the first city on earth did not rise for glory, but for shelter, not for power, but for presence, not to conquer the world, but to belong in it, and in that it succeeded beyond measure. Jericho's story is not one of endings. It is a story of return, of homecoming, of the oldest threads in the human story still tied gently but firmly to the present day. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself walking that gentle hill, the dust warm beneath your feet, the spring whispering beside you, and far off, in every direction, the long breath of time, quiet, unbroken, and still flowing, just like it always has. Imagine just for a moment the layers beneath your feet if you were standing on the ancient mound of Tel es Sultan. One step upon the surface, and you're already walking on thousands of years of footsteps. Beneath you lie buried homes and courtyards, collapsed roofs, scattered beads, broken tools, smoothed bones. Not artifacts in a museum sense, but fragments of actual lives once lived in a rhythm now almost beyond comprehension. What's remarkable is not just the age of Jericho, but how long people kept returning to it. Abandonments came, yes, fire, drought, or conflict may have driven the inhabitants away from time to time, and still, again and again, they returned. Each time they rebuilt, each time they brought with them new customs, new tools, sometimes even new languages, but the place, the heart of it, remained. It's as if something about Jericho, its shape, its water, its air, called people back, not just to survive, but to settle, to build, to dream. In the early Bronze Age, new fortifications were raised, thick defensive walls with towers and gates. Houses were rearranged, stone replaced mud brick, and yet the spring still flowed beside them. Later, in the Middle Bronze Age, a great rectangular palace was built nearby. Its rooms were broad and finely plastered. This was not a place of modest huts. By then, Jericho was a city of kings, a place of wealth and trade, commanding the narrow pass that led travelers between the Jordan Valley and the heartlands of Canaan. You could say Jericho had become a threshold, a place you passed through between worlds, but it never lost its sense of being a place in its own right. Even in the stories handed down in later scriptures, Jericho is never anonymous. It always feels specific. The city of palm trees, the city where walls fell, the city where new journeys began, and then came the late Bronze Age, the time when, according to tradition, Jericho was taken by the Israelites under Joshua. Whether the biblical account is fact, fiction, or something in between, what is clear archaeologically is that around the 15th or 14th century BCE, the city's great walls were destroyed, many homes were burned, and for a time, silence. But once again, it was not the end. Later peoples came. The Iron Age left its mark. Hellenistic buildings rose centuries later, and Roman baths were eventually laid upon the ruins of homes that had been ancient, even in Julius Caesar's lifetime. All the while, the spring never ceased. In this, Jericho has always carried with it a kind of quiet resistance, a stubbornness in the face of time, a patience that no war, no flame, no sandstorm could fully erase. And perhaps that's why Jericho still captivates us, because in its story we sense something deep and slow-moving, something vast and patient, like the murmur of the spring itself, a place not born of conquest or invention, but of presence, a place that simply is, and has always been. There are other ancient cities in the world, Dart el-Hoyuk in Anatolia, Byblos in Lebanon, Damascus and Aleppo, still lived in today, each with its own long complicated tale. But Jericho stands apart, not because it was the biggest or the richest or the most powerful, but because it was the first to gather so much history in one small fertile place, because it was the first to try to settle the world with memory. Tonight, as your thoughts drift and settle, picture the cool waters of the spring still bubbling beneath the hill. Picture the soft flicker of firelight inside one of those earliest circular homes, roofed with brush and earth. Picture a hand grinding grain into flour, a child reaching for a date from a basket, a pair of voices murmuring to one another in a language long lost. You do not know their names, but they knew the stars, they knew the winds, they knew the weight of quiet, enduring time. And now, you do too. It is strange to think, isn't it, that the very first people who gathered at the foot of the spring so many thousands of years ago were not so different from us. They had no written language, no books or maps or history to guide them, yet they watched the seasons. They followed the stars. They felt the warmth of the sun on their backs and the cool shade beneath the reeds. They listened to the water and heard something sacred in its constancy, and little by little, they built something. Not all at once, not with grand plans or city blueprints, but slowly, home by home, hearth by hearth, a village formed. Their homes at first were round, built from mud and straw. Their thick walls helped to keep out the dust and hold in the warmth. Roofs were flat, likely made from timber, brush, and earth, and in the center of these spaces, a hearth, always a hearth, where families gathered, and warmth glowed softly in the blue darkness of evening. No palaces, no temples, no thrones, just people and time. Yet even these earliest dwellers began to think beyond the everyday. They carved beads and pendants. They buried their dead carefully, sometimes beneath their own homes. In some cases, they returned to those bones later, retrieving the skulls, covering them with layers of plaster, shaping noses, cheeks and brows, and setting them in places of honor. Why? Perhaps it was to remember the dead. Perhaps it was to keep the ancestors near, or perhaps it was to hold on to something, identity, belonging, story, in a world that was still wild and still full of mystery. And it was around this same time, roughly 10,000 years ago, that something extraordinary happened. Just beside those modest homes, someone, or some group of people, decided to build something new, something different, a tower. It was circular, nearly 10 meters across at the base, rising over 8 meters high, massive for its time. Inside, a long staircase coiled upward, carved with care, made of stone. This was no ordinary storage silo. This was something more. Some scholars think it may have been a defensive structure, a place to spot threats from afar. Others wonder if it was a marker, a way to align the community with the movement of the sun or stars, suggesting a shared cosmology, a common worldview. And still others believe it might have been a symbol, a gathering point, a shared project that bound the community together, a way of saying, we are here, we belong. Whatever its purpose, the tower stood for centuries, and in standing, it marked a turning point in human history. Because here in Jericho, we see one of the first glimpses of monumentality, not just survival, not just shelter, but intention, vision, a desire to shape the land, and in doing so, shape identity itself. This was no longer simply a gathering of huts around a spring. This was a city in its earliest breath, and all the while, the spring continued to flow. Its waters nourished barley and wheat, flocks of goats and sheep were tended nearby. Dogs padded softly beside their owners, the first domesticated companions, and the people stayed. Not for a season or two, but for generations. New houses replaced the old, families grew, skills were passed on, tools became finer, walls became straighter. The round homes gave way to square ones, and slowly, the language of architecture changed, a signal of evolving minds, shifting needs, and ever-deepening roots. And still, through it all, that low murmur of water beneath the hill never ceased. Tonight, as you settle into stillness, imagine that very sound, the soft gurgle of a spring threading its way between stone and sand. Imagine the hush of a late Neolithic evening, the brush of warm wind through date palms, the glow of firelight slipping from an open doorway. A city, not of noise or grandeur, but of endurance, a place where people quietly learned how to live together. They did not know what they were starting, but they built it anyway, and in doing so, they gave us one of our very first blueprints for belonging. Close your eyes now, and rest near the spring. We are not so far from them as we once believed. Beneath the rising heat of the early Holocene sun, the land around Jericho began to change, subtly, then significantly. Where once there had been open ground with scattered huts, now there were paths trodden hard into the earth, routines etched into the dust, footsteps repeated across seasons, across lifetimes, and still the people stayed. Over generations they learned more about the soil. They learned what the grain needed, how to time the sowing, when to harvest, and what to store. Clay-lined pits were used to keep the precious barley safe from the dry winds and pests. Granaries emerged, not just for family, but for the community, shared stores, shared risks, shared hopes, and slowly from this shared survival came the early roots of society. A rhythm developed, one that pulsed through the fields, through the homes, through the hands of the people. Wake, tend, gather, grind, bake. Children were born and grew up watching their parents push seeds into the soft brown soil. They grew up with the scent of baked grain, the rough texture of woven baskets, the murmur of stories around the hearth. It was here that humanity quietly began to change. Because to live in one place, not just for a time but for good, required more than just food. It required trust, cooperation, agreements between people, and with that came a new need for memory, for continuity, for shared meaning. And so, with no written language to record it, memory became ritual. The dead were honored in layers of ceremony. Burials became more complex. Sometimes skulls were kept and decorated, as we've seen. Other times, bodies were buried beneath the floor of the home, perhaps to keep them close, to anchor the household to its past, perhaps to remind the living of those who came before. It's difficult to be sure. These were not people who wrote down their thoughts, but they were people who remembered, people who felt things deeply enough to shape the world around their feelings. Outside their homes, the hills turned green after the rains. The spring still flowed, offering water without asking in return. Goats bleated in the pens, and children ran in and out of shadowed doorways. Life pulsed here, quietly but without pause. And yet, not all was peaceful. At some point we know they built a wall, a wide stone wall, thick and tall enough to require a huge effort of communal labor. Some say it was for defense, but against whom? This early in time, there is little evidence of organized war. No battlefields, no armies. Still, others argue it may have been to keep out wild animals, or to protect against floods, though no major water source threatens the site today. And some suggest it may have been more symbolic, a circle around the city, a way of marking us and them, a way to say this is ours, this is where we belong. Whatever its purpose, the wall changed everything, because in building it, Jericho's people created not just protection but identity, a boundary that turned a collection of homes into a place with meaning. They would have gathered together, stone by stone, passing each piece hand to hand. They would have planned, argued, solved problems, watched the wall rise under the same sun they had always known. And when it was finished, they would have looked out over the landscape and felt different. This was their place, their city, and as time wore on, it would continue to grow, not just in size but in complexity. Walls would be repaired, homes would be rebuilt, new tools crafted, generations passed, and memory deepened. What began as a place by the spring became something more, a center of life, a center of meaning, perhaps even a center of power, but not power as we might recognize today. Not yet. These were still simple people, by our standards, but their achievements were vast. For in building Jericho, they built the foundation of city life, millennia before Uruk, long before Rome, and eons before our modern skylines reached upward. Close your eyes now and let the thought settle somewhere, deep beneath layers of earth and time. The first tower still sleeps, stones resting just as they were placed, a staircase winding into ancient shadow, waiting as always by the spring that never dried. Even as centuries passed, the story of Jericho continued to evolve, not quickly, not with sudden revolutions, but in quiet, steady layers, like sediment settling at the bottom of a calm pool. One generation gave way to the next, and each added something, a new tool, a new wall, a new way of understanding the world. Around 8000 BCE, the homes began to change again. The round houses gave way, increasingly, to rectangular ones, a small shift, but one with deep implications. Rectangles are easier to join side by side, to line up in orderly rows, to plan into neighborhoods. It suggests something had changed in how people lived with each other, no longer just family clusters. Now perhaps, the beginnings of districts, of streets, of community structures that required a shared vision of space. The old ways weren't abandoned overnight, but they blended into new ones. And through it all, the people still gathered near the spring, and still they buried their dead beneath the floor. Many of these early burials were accompanied by grave goods, beads, tools, sometimes small figures, shaped by hand from clay or stone. The skulls, in particular, remained deeply important. Over and over again, we find them carefully preserved, covered in plaster, with shell inlays for eyes and traces of red pigment, not macabre, but reverent. a way of keeping a face in the memory of the living. Were they loved ones? Ancestors? Leaders? Shamans? We may never know for certain, but it tells us something remarkable. These early people, so far removed from modern civilization, were already trying to carry the past forward. They weren't just surviving, they were remembering, and memory, once shaped and shared, becomes something larger. It becomes culture. Over time, new technologies reached Jericho: obsidian blades, traded from distant mountains, new types of baskets, early signs of woven fabric. Every innovation that entered the valley would have echoed through daily life, in how people dressed, cooked, hunted, stored food, and told stories. And perhaps this is the most extraordinary thing, the way Jericho remained connected, not just to its past, but to the broader world. It wasn't isolated, even then. Paths stretched away into the desert, carrying goods, news, maybe even ideas. People came and went. Some stayed, drawn to the water and the shelter. Others moved on, carrying a memory of the city with them. And so Jericho grew, not just upward or outward, but inward, too, into its own traditions, its own rhythm. Fires still burned in clay hearths. Children still ran barefoot through the dust. The spring, ever constant, still spilled its waters into the waiting troughs and ditches. And if you listened at night, as the stars wheeled overhead and the crickets stirred among the stones, you might have heard voices, low, warm voices, sharing stories older than any wall, stories about where the people came from, about the spring that never failed, about the tower that had always stood, older than memory. By now Jericho had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, longer than most civilizations last. And yet it endured, because people remembered, because they stayed, because the spring kept flowing. Close your eyes now, and imagine what it might have been like to walk its dusty paths, to greet a neighbor, to bend and drink from the cold water as the morning sun climbed over the hills. Imagine the hush before sunrise, and the long soft exhale of a city that had never needed grandeur to matter. Its greatness came from time, and time in Jericho was deeper than stone. As the years turned to centuries, and the centuries into millennia, life in Jericho changed once again, not abruptly, but gradually, as the lines of tradition shifted with each new generation. Somewhere around 7000 BCE, new materials began to appear among the people. Clay, once just used for hearths and packed walls, was now being shaped, hardened, and fired. Pottery had arrived, delicate at first, simple shapes with little decoration, but revolutionary all the same. With pottery came new possibilities. Now food could be stored more easily, and water could be carried further. Meals could be prepared with greater variety, and stored food could last through leaner times. A change in material, but one with wide, rippling effects across daily life. These changes are often quiet at first, slow enough that no one notices the exact moment they begin. But in hindsight, they mark the dawn of something new. The houses, too, continued to shift. By this period, most were rectangular and closely packed, perhaps sharing walls, perhaps forming long rows along narrow footpaths. Inside, the floors were still plastered smooth, sometimes painted with red or black pigment. Puths sat in corners, storage pits dotted the rooms. Life had become more structured, more organized, yet still deeply tied to the rhythms of the spring and the earth. What's striking is how deeply Jericho's identity remained rooted in memory, in the past. Even as new materials and ideas entered the city, the people preserved certain practices. Ancestors were still buried in the same way, under floors, close to the heart of the home. Some skulls were still preserved, modeled with care and reverence. The bond between the living and the dead had not been forgotten. This was not just a city of the present, it was a city of remembrance. But no city, no matter how timeless, is immune to the slow march of the world beyond its borders. By the mid-7th millennium BCE, signs begin to emerge of challenges from the outside, perhaps not in the form of invasion, but of change. New groups were moving through the Levant, bringing with them different traditions. People began building with different techniques. The architectural layers grow more varied. Some buildings seem less carefully constructed. Some levels suggest a break, a period when life here slowed, or paused, or scattered. And yet, the spring still flowed. Even when the city's population dipped, even when the buildings were abandoned or fell into ruin, the land remained, and in time people returned. They always did. Because Jericho was not simply a city of buildings, it was a city of place, of deep familiarity, and of belonging. Later, long after the first farmers and builders, long after the modeled skulls and silent towers, new people arrived. They brought different tools, new crops, fresh animals, and more importantly, new gods. Where the earliest inhabitants may have looked to the spring as their center, these new settlers brought more formal rituals, shrines, sacred hearths. The spiritual life of Jericho deepened, or perhaps just changed in form, and still, the city remained. A small rise of earth at the edge of the desert, a ribbon of green beside an ancient spring, not always mighty, not always large, but always there. Imagine, if you will, the texture of this city in those days, the wind brushing over the low rooftops, the scent of firewood and wheat, a family kneeling to gather water as the last light slips behind the hills, and deep below, layer upon layer, the bones of those who came before, lying in the dust and silence, remembered by those above. You are walking slowly into a past so long ago, it scarcely seems real, yet it was, and it happened here. By the time the 6th millennium BCE arrived, Jericho had already seen more history pass beneath its feet than most places on Earth ever would. It had stood through the melting of glaciers, through the first planting of barley by human hands, through the shaping of stone and bone, the firing of clay, the taming of goats and sheep. It had risen and fallen and risen again, each time quietly, patiently, without ceremony, like a breath in the earth. And yet, as remarkable as its age was, Jericho was not frozen in time. New waves of migration brought new energies. Across the Fertile Crescent, from the highlands of Anatolia to the floodplains of Sumer, small communities were growing more interconnected. Ideas spread, methods of weaving, ways to build stronger homes, and most profoundly beliefs. Spiritual life in Jericho began to take on a different tone. The modeled skulls of the early Neolithic were no longer practiced. Their meanings, whether they had been tokens of remembrance, symbols of status, or ancestral guardians, faded into memory. But new rituals emerged. Figurines shaped from clay, some barely a few inches tall, began to appear. Fertility symbols, household gods, offerings placed in the corners of homes or buried beneath thresholds, as if asking protection for what stood above. The idea of the sacred was shifting, from the body of the ancestor to the figure of the divine. You might picture one of these homes, a woman kneeling in the dust at dawn, smoothing clay into the shape of a small goddess with rounded hips and a soft curve of belly. She places it gently in a bowl near the hearth and hums a melody no one will ever record. What was she asking for? A good harvest? The safe birth of a child? Simply a little peace? We'll never know. But her voice still echoes faintly in the silence of Tel Sultan. As for the city itself, its layout too was changing. While once the houses had been packed closely within defensive walls, later periods show a more open pattern. Clusters of homes, small courts, perhaps a communal granary. The need for rigid boundaries, so urgent in the earlier days, seemed to have softened. Perhaps life had grown more secure, or perhaps the threats had changed in nature, not invaders at the gates, but the slow encroachment of salt in the soil, or a year when the rains failed. Even so, people adapted. Always, the strength of Jericho was never in its size or splendor, it was in its resilience, and yet, there were times when that resilience was tested to its limits. Around the middle of the 6th millennium BCE, there is evidence that Jericho may have been abandoned again, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually as the spring grew less predictable, or as trade routes shifted, or simply because the young desired something new beyond the old city's edges. For a time the site may have been nearly silent. The wind drifting through crumbled stone, the walls fallen inward, overtaken by the dust they once held back. The spring still flowing, but with no one there to drink. But even then Jericho did not die. It rested. Later generations returned. Sometimes hundreds of years later, they cleared the old rubble, built anew, left their own traces. And when they too moved on, the great mound of layered time grew higher. It is hard to grasp the patience of such a place. In our world, cities rise in decades and vanish within a generation. But Jericho is of another order, a place not of centuries but of epochs, and it was still only halfway through its long unbroken breath. In the layers that follow, silence becomes just as telling as activity. The middle of the 6th millennium BCE left fewer signs than what came before, a quieter time in Jericho's story. And yet, as always, the spring remained. That small miracle of geology, a bubbling source of fresh water in a land so often starved of it, continued to flow as it had for millennia. and where water persists, life eventually follows. When settlers returned again, they did not simply resume the old ways. They brought new tools, new customs, new ways of living that reflected changes happening far beyond Jericho itself. Across the wider Near East, the Chalcolithic Age had begun. The name means copper stone, and it marked the first time in human history that metals, however soft and limited, began to shape daily life. Not in Jericho at first, but elsewhere, copper tools were appearing, small chisels, decorative pins, axes. People were beginning to hammer metal into shape, to smelt, to pour molten ore into molds. It would be a slow revolution, and Jericho, by then more provincial than central, was no longer at the forefront. Still, these changes would reach even here. You might imagine a man holding a small copper blade for the first time. It gleams in the morning sun, sharper than anything bone or stone could manage. He turns it in his fingers, not fully understanding how it was made, only that it cuts like nothing else. And somewhere nearby, another woman still shapes her pots by hand, still weaves her linen from flax, still leaves offerings at the foot of her small household altar. Some things change, others linger. This period also saw greater complexity in how people organized their lives. In other regions, people were building ceremonial centers, sites like Göbekli Tepe, and later, Çatalhöyük, where ritual and everyday life blurred. Hierarchies were forming. Some groups were gaining more influence than others. Inheritance, trade, and control over resources began to shape how settlements grew. In Jericho, we begin to see hints of this. Larger buildings, communal storage areas, perhaps early signs of inequality, though in such early periods, hierarchy is more subtle. A home closer to the spring, a grave with more beads, a storehouse with more grain. None of these things declare power outright, but they whisper of it. And yet, even in this shifting world, Jericho remained a place of persistence. To live here was to be in dialogue with the past. Each new house was built upon an old one. Every floor rested atop the memory of another. People still buried their dead beneath their homes, still painted walls with ochre, still pressed their fingers into wet clay just as their ancestors had done 3,000 years before. We forget how rare that is, for a place to be lived in for generations without a break, for customs to pass not in books but in gestures, the way to build a wall, the right moment to harvest barley, the song sung at a burial. This was a kind of memory no scroll could hold. By now, the people of Jericho were not the same as those who first settled here at the edge of the Ice Age. Their language had changed. Their beliefs had shifted. Their faces too may have looked different, but they carried something older, the habit of staying, of shaping a life in this quiet green space at the base of the hills. And perhaps that is what defines a city, not its walls, not its towers, but the thread of continuity. The idea that life can stretch across generations in the same place, adapting, layering, returning. In that sense, Jericho was not just the first city, it was a promise that people could live together, build together, and remember together, even when the world changed. By the early 4th millennium BCE, the world beyond Jericho had begun to stir with new kinds of energy. Across the fertile plains of Sumer, the great cities of Uruk and Eridu were rising, not as simple towns, but as true urban centers, layered with temples, palaces, bureaucracy, and writing. Civilization, as we often define it, was blooming, and yet here, in Jericho, the rhythm remained slower, more ancient. The people of this quiet oasis did not rush into the urban experiment. Instead, they seemed to hold a space apart, a whisper of the old world, still shaped by earth and water, memory and stone, but change would come. This period, the late Chalcolithic and into the early Bronze Age, brought the world closer together. Trade routes began to crisscross the deserts and hills. Copper flowed from Anatolia, obsidian from the Caucasus, lapis lazuli all the way from distant Afghanistan. Even in Jericho, far from the bustling river deltas of Mesopotamia, the fingerprints of this global web could be felt. Shards of imported pottery, beads of unfamiliar stone, tiny weights for measuring trade, and hints too of new influences in art and ritual. One can imagine a caravan arriving in the night, camels rustling and breathing beneath the moonlight, the air dry with dust. Traders would unroll their bundles near the spring, offering copper trinkets, woven textiles, and stories from cities that seemed impossibly far away. And the people of Jericho, quiet farmers, potters, shepherds, would listen. What stories they heard, we do not know. What they made of those distant lands, we can only guess. But slowly, across the generations, Jericho opened again to the wider world. Archaeologically, we begin to see signs of new building techniques, mud bricks now fired with more consistency, laid in straighter lines, sometimes even reinforced with timber or stone. Houses were no longer merely shelter, they were statements. Some grew larger than others. Some clustered around shared courtyards, some contained shrines. It is during this period that Jericho first showed signs of formal city planning, not in the grand gridded sense of later cities, but in its own quiet way. Paths were smoothed between homes, storage spaces were shared, markets perhaps formed at the edges of the spring, where sellers could lay out goods on mats beneath the shade of palms. The idea of a town, an organized, permanent community with distinct roles, shared norms and lasting boundaries, was no longer just a memory, it was a lived reality. But this growth came at a cost, for with permanence, with wealth, with exposure to trade and influence, came vulnerability. Walls were built again, not the vast Neolithic defenses of old, but newer fortifications, likely designed to keep out raiders or rivals. The spring, ever central, was now surrounded by walls that ensured control over the water source itself. Who controlled it? Perhaps a council of elders, perhaps a priestly class, perhaps a strongman or chieftain, whose house stood higher than the rest. We do not know their names, but their presence is felt in the bones of the city, in the divisions of space, the patterns of burials, the unequal spread of goods among the dead. Jericho, once a place of near equal subsistence, had begun to stratify, and still, the people endured. Even in the face of growing inequality, of raids from rival tribes, of trade routes that could bring both goods and diseases, life continued here, quietly, daily. Grain was still ground by hand in stone mortars, water still carried in clay jars from the spring, goats still called from their pens, children still ran barefoot through the dust, chasing each other through the same sunlit paths trodden by ancestors thousands of years before. The city was changing. The world was changing. But Jericho, in some ineffable way, remained Jericho, a place of firsts, a place of continuity, and though storms would come, literal and human, the story would go on. The Bronze Age was not gentle. Across the Levant and beyond, it brought with it the rise of kingdoms, the birth of dynasties, and a new language of power, one written in stone and blood. Walls grew higher, temples grew richer, armies marched, cities fell, and yet, Jericho endured. It had no empire. It issued no royal edicts carved in rock. It minted no coins, and wrote no epic. But somehow, through the changing centuries, this quiet city at the edge of the Jordan Valley persisted. Perhaps it was because of its location, near trade routes, yet not the object of imperial conquest. Perhaps it was the spring itself, a guarantee of life, no matter the turmoil of the age. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a cultural resilience passed down in stories and customs, in rhythms of planting and harvest, in the patterns of the stars watched by generations of shepherds. Still, signs of struggle appear in the archaeological record. Layer upon layer shows a cycle familiar to ancient cities, building, burning, rebuilding. Jericho, like all long-lived places, bore its scars. One such scar dates to around 2300 BCE. A destruction layer thick with ash and debris, marked by collapsed walls and broken pottery. We do not know the cause. Was it invasion, earthquake, internal strife? There is no record, only the silence of collapsed homes and the soot of a fire long since gone cold. But what matters most is what came after the rebuilding. Every time the city was destroyed, the people came back. They raised the walls again. They shaped fresh bricks from clay and straw, baked them in the sun, and laid them atop the wreckage of the old. They planted anew. They sang again. There is something profoundly human in that. Some cities fade with a single fall, forgotten and abandoned, their names lost to time. But Jericho refused to vanish. Even in its smallest phases, when the population may have dwindled to a few hundred, it continued, a thread unbroken, and life here wasn't only about survival. Evidence suggests moments of beauty, too. Decorated pottery, simple but lovingly crafted, beads carved from bone and shell, fragments of music instruments, and burial sites adorned with care. Even in hardship, the people of Jericho took time for art, for ritual, for memory. It's easy to forget, looking at crumbling walls or broken jars in a museum, that real lives were lived here, that someone once sat beneath a fig tree in the heat of the afternoon, that someone whispered lullabies to their child as the wind stirred the reeds by the spring. The city changed again around 1550 BCE. another destruction, likely tied to larger movements of people and power in the region. Some scholars link this layer to the rise of the Hyksos, or the later encroachments of Egyptian influence into Canaan. But again, Jericho rose. It had become a place that could not simply disappear, not just a city, but a symbol, a link in a chain that stretched unbroken from the Stone Age to the cusp of recorded history. And though larger cities would eventually outshine it, cities with kings, armies, and libraries, Jericho remained what it had always been, a place rooted in water, earth, and time. As the late Bronze Age approached, the world began to hum with writing. Cuneiform tablets recorded transactions and treaties, hieroglyphs told the stories of gods and kings, Mycenaean palaces and Hittite courts flourished. But here in Jericho, silence still ruled. No tablets, no inscriptions, only the layers of living. It is a humbler story perhaps, but it is no less grand, for in the quiet persistence of this city, in its millennia of meals cooked, songs sung, paths walked, we find not only history, but humanity. In the final centuries of the Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean trembled. Great civilizations, Egypt, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, all felt the weight of chaos. Trade routes faltered, empires collapsed. Across the land, once thriving cities were reduced to ash. This widespread unraveling is known today as the Late Bronze Age collapse, and Jericho too met its silence. Around 1400 BCE, the city fell, not for the first time but perhaps for the last time in its ancient form. The destruction layer at this level is thick, dark, unmistakable. What came after was no longer the old Jericho. No more great walls, no more towers, just traces of scattered huts and smaller, quieter lives. For centuries after, the site of Jericho remained a modest settlement, far removed from the bustling centers of power that now rose elsewhere. Kingdoms came and went. The Israelites, the Babylonians, the Persians. Stories of conquest were written down, tales of trumpets and falling walls, but these were stories written generations after the fact, and Jericho did not speak for itself. There were no monuments raised in its name, no epic poems to record its glories, just the patient testimony of the ground, unearthed one layer at a time. Even so, the spring never dried. People continued to return to this place. Roman soldiers once stood guard here. Byzantine farmers once worked these fields. Islamic scholars studied under the shade of its palms. Crusaders passed through, then Ottomans, then explorers from far-off lands, and finally the archaeologists who gently pulled back the earth, searching for the first breaths of history. And still today, Jericho lives. Modern buildings rise around the ancient tell. Families walk the same paths trodden by their ancestors 10,000 years ago. Children splash in the spring. The smell of bread baking drifts across the warm air. It is hard to truly grasp what that means. A place where humans have lived continuously for over 10,000 years, before pyramids, before Stonehenge, before the wheel, or writing, or war, as we know it. Jericho is not just a city, it is a beginning. Here, in this unlikely oasis at the edge of the Jordan Valley, humanity stepped out of the long cold sleep of the Ice Age, and began to dream in stone and earth. They built walls, they built homes, they built lives, not because they had to, but because something within them, within us, longed to stay. That longing still echoes in the dust of the tell, in the soft trickle of the spring, in the evening wind that moves through the valley as it has for thousands of years. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of Jericho. Not greatness, not glory, but endurance, and the quiet, steady beat of human life, beginning again, and again, and again.